After 9 years in a federal penitentiary for a crime I did not commit, I thought the hardest part of my life was finally over. I thought the nightmare was behind me, and I was coming home to a loyal wife and a son who missed me. But as I stood in the freezing rain outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of my own Highland Park estate, I realized my prison sentence had not ended at all. It had simply changed locations. What I saw inside that beautiful, warm living room did not just break my heart. It completely shattered everything I believed about my life, and it proved that the people I loved the most were the exact same people who had buried me alive. If you have ever given everything to your family only to be stabbed in the back, hit the like button and tell me where you are listening from in the comments below. Because what I did next is something they never saw coming. My name is Thomas Barrett. I am 70 years old, and for the last 9 years, my identity was reduced to an inmate number stitched onto a cheap khaki uniform. Before the trial, before the federal agents raided my office and froze my accounts, I was the founder and chief executive officer of a logistics firm worth $42 million. I built that company from a single rented delivery truck into a national empire. I worked 80-hour weeks. I missed birthdays and anniversaries, all to ensure that my wife Diane and my son Jason would never have to worry about a single financial burden. They had the luxury cars, the country club memberships, and the sprawling mansion in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Illinois. I lost it all when I was convicted of corporate wire fraud. The prosecution claimed I had been moving millions of dollars through offshore accounts. I knew I was innocent. I knew someone had set me up. But the paper trail was flawlessly manipulated, and the judge sentenced me to a decade behind bars. Through it all, I kept my sanity by holding on to the image of my family. Diane visited me a few times during the first year, crying through the thick glass, promising she would wait for me. My former best friend and business partner, Martin Cole, promised he would take care of them while I was locked away. I was released 3 months early due to a sudden clerical recalculation of my good behavior credits. I did not use my one phone call to tell them I was coming. I wanted it to be a surprise. I wanted to walk through that front door, wrap my arms around my wife, and finally breathe the air of a free man. I took a commercial bus from the facility, watching the gray concrete world of the prison fade into the lush, manicured suburbs of Highland Park. The autumn air was bitterly cold, biting through the thin fabric of the generic gray suit the prison had given me upon my release. I walked the last 2 miles from the bus stop. My joints ached and my legs felt heavy, but my heart was racing with pure anticipation. When I finally reached the end of my street, the house looked exactly as I remembered it. The towering oak trees, the immaculate driveway, the warm golden light spilling out from the massive windows. It was a picture of perfect domestic bliss. I walked up the driveway, but something made me stop. Maybe it was the instinct of a man who had spent a decade surrounded by predators, or maybe it was just a strange twist of fate. Instead of walking up to those grand front doors and ringing the bell, I stepped off the pavement and walked around the side of the house, moving quietly through the shadows of the tall evergreen bushes. I made my way to the backyard patio. The living room had massive glass walls that offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the inside. I stood in the dark, shivering in the cold, and looked into my home. The fire was roaring in the stone fireplace. Diane was standing by the leather sofa. She looked beautiful, hardly aged a day, wearing an elegant silk blouse and a diamond necklace that caught the firelight. But she was not alone. Standing right in front of her was Martin Cole, my best friend, the man who had stood beside me at my wedding, the man who had promised to protect my family. At first, I thought they were just having a conversation. I thought Martin was just checking in on her. But then Martin reached out. He placed his hands on Diane's waist, pulling her close. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed him. It was not a friendly kiss. It was deep, passionate, and horribly familiar. It was the kiss of two people who had been doing this for a very long time. My breath caught in my throat. My hands, calloused and scarred from years of prison labor, curled into tight fists. I felt a physical pain in my chest, sharper and more agonizing than anything I had experienced behind bars. Suddenly, the living room door swung open. My son Jason walked into the room. He is 28 years old now, a grown man wearing a tailored suit holding a crystal decanter of expensive scotch. I expected him to freeze. I expected him to shout, to be disgusted at the sight of another man kissing his mother. But Jason did not even blink. He simply walked over to the home bar, poured himself a drink, and chuckled. He looked completely at ease, entirely comfortable with the grotesque scene unfolding in front of me. Martin pulled away from Diane, a smug smile plastered across his face. I pressed my ear against the cold glass. The patio doors were cracked open just enough to let the fresh air in, and their voices carried out into the night, clear and devastating. Jason took a sip of his scotch and looked at Martin. He asked if Martin had heard anything from the warden yet. He said the old man is supposed to get out sometime this week, right? Martin adjusted his expensive tie and laughed. He said yes, the prison called his office to confirm the address. Thomas gets out by Friday. But he told Jason not to worry because he had the entire situation under control. He told them to just stick to the script they practiced. Diane leaned against Martin, tracing the lapel of his suit. She asked if he was sure I was going to sign it. She asked what would happen if I got suspicious, or if I wanted to see the company books. Martin scoffed, a sound full of absolute contempt. He said I was a broken, clueless old man who just spent 9 years sleeping on a steel cot. He said I had zero leverage. He explained that when I walk through that door, they will play the grieving, supportive family. They will tell me the transition was tough. Then they will hand me the non-disclosure agreement disguised as a generous retirement package. Jason nodded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He said $5,000 a month to keep me quiet in a cheap apartment somewhere far away from here. He added that it should be enough for me to buy my groceries and stay out of their way. Diana asked what would happen if I refused, her voice entirely devoid of the warmth she used to reserve for me. She asked what would happen if I tried to fight for my shares. Martin said coldly that they would cut me off completely. He said they would remind me that I am a convicted felon. He promised that if I tried to step foot in Cole Global, he would personally call his contacts at the parole board and make sure I violated my terms of release. He said I would take the $5,000 a month, sign the gag order, and disappear because I would think they were my only lifeline. I stood there in the dark, the freezing rain soaking through my thin suit, soaking into my bones. Cole Global. Martin had not just taken my wife and corrupted my son. He had erased my name from the $42 million empire I built from nothing. He had stolen my entire existence. Every lie, every visit, every letter they sent me over the last 9 years had been a carefully constructed facade to keep me docile while they looted my life. They thought I was a pathetic, senile old man who would grovel for their scraps. They thought I was too broken to fight back. My first instinct was to grab a heavy rock from the garden, smash through that glass window, and tear Martin apart with my bare hands. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to flip that coffee table and watch the absolute terror wash over their deceitful faces. But the 9 years I spent in a maximum security prison had taught me one extremely valuable lesson. Violence and emotion are the weapons of the weak. Patience and silence are the weapons of a man who is about to destroy an empire. I did not storm in. I did not make a single sound. I slowly took a step back, letting the dark shadows of the evergreen bushes swallow me whole. I looked at the three of them laughing by the fire, drinking the expensive scotch my money had bought, standing in the house I had built with my own hands. I took a deep breath, letting the icy winter air fill my lungs. The grief and the heartbreak evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. I turned around and walked quietly back down the driveway toward the front door. They wanted to play a game with a clueless old man. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, I was going to walk through the front door, I was going to play the broken, grateful ex-convict, and I was going to smile as I let them hand me my own money. But they had no idea that the man standing on their porch was no longer the trusting husband and father they remembered. The war had just begun, and I was not going to stop until I took back every single thing that belonged to me and watched their perfect stolen lives crumble to the ground. I stepped onto the grand limestone porch and pressed my thumb against the glowing brass doorbell. The familiar chime echoed inside the foyer, a sound that used to mean I was finally home after a grueling week of corporate meetings. Now it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. I waited, keeping my shoulders slumped and my gaze fixed on the polished welcome mat. I needed to look small. I needed to look like a man whose spirit had been entirely crushed by the federal justice system. Heavy footsteps approached from the other side of the oak door. I heard the deadbolt click and the door swung open. Martin stood there. For a fraction of a second, the blood completely drained from his face. His confident posture vanished, replaced by pure, unfiltered panic. He had not expected me to arrive tonight. He had not expected to look the man he betrayed directly in the eye without a few days of preparation. But Martin had always been an excellent liar. Before I could even say a word, the shock on his face melted away, replaced instantly by a mask of profound brotherly joy. His eyes widened, and he let out a loud gasp of disbelief. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, pulling me into a crushing embrace. I stood there, letting the man who had stolen my wife and my empire press his face against my shoulder. The scent of his expensive cologne made my stomach turn, but I forced my arms to clumsily pat his back. I played my part flawlessly. I let out a shaky, tired breath sounding exactly like a man who had just survived a decade of hell. Martin pulled back, keeping his hands firmly on my shoulders as he looked me up and down. He shook his head, offering a wide, beaming smile that did not reach his cold eyes. He said he could not believe I was actually standing here. He said they were not expecting me until Friday, and that I should have called so he could send a private car to pick me up from the facility. I kept my voice weak and raspy, telling him I just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. Before he could respond, I heard the frantic click of heels rushing down the curved staircase. Diane appeared in the grand foyer. She stopped halfway down the steps, dramatically bringing both hands to her mouth. She let out a loud, theatrical sob that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. She rushed down the remaining steps, practically throwing herself into my arms. She buried her face in my cheap, damp suit and began to cry uncontrollably. Her tears soaked through the thin fabric, and she kept repeating my name over and over again. I held her, wrapping my arms around the woman I had loved since my 20s. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to push her away. Just 10 minutes ago, I had watched her kissing another man with absolute passion. Now she was sobbing against my chest, playing the role of the devoted, suffering wife who had waited 9 agonizing years for her husband to return. I gently stroked her hair, maintaining my fragile facade. I told her I was finally home and that everything was going to be all right now. Martin quickly ushered us out of the cold hallway and into the massive open-concept kitchen. The kitchen island was a stunning slab of imported marble glowing under the warm pendant lights. Jason was sitting on one of the leather bar stools. He looked at me, feigning overwhelming surprise, and quickly stood up to offer a stiff, awkward hug. He told me he missed me, and I smiled softly, telling him how proud I was to see the man he had become. I looked around the room, making sure my eyes lingered on the details. I saw the new espresso machine, the custom wine fridge stocked with vintage bottles, and an abstract painting on the far wall that easily cost $100,000. I let my confusion slowly show on my face. I looked directly at Martin, then back to my wife. I asked the question they had been waiting for. I asked Martin why he was standing in my kitchen at this hour. I let my voice waver just a little bit, injecting a perfect tone of vulnerability and confusion. I asked if something was wrong with the company, or if he was just here to help Diane prepare for my arrival. Martin exchanged a quick, calculated look with Diane. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his styled hair, and adopted an expression of solemn burden. He walked over to the marble island, gesturing for me to take a seat. I sat down slowly, rubbing my hands together, as if I was trying to stay warm. Martin stood across from me, placing his hands flat on the cold marble. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity. He lowered his voice, speaking in a careful tone. He said that when the federal agents raided our offices 9 years ago, the government immediately moved to freeze every single asset attached to my name. He reminded me that the prosecution was trying to seize the estate, empty the bank accounts, and leave my family with absolutely nothing. He said that Diane and Jason were days away from being thrown out onto the street. Martin paused, letting out a heavy sigh, acting as though the memory was painful for him to recall. He said he could not just stand by and watch his best friend's family lose everything. He told me that his legal team found a massive loophole in the asset forfeiture laws. He claimed that the only way to protect the house and the remaining private funds from the government was to legally merge the estates. He looked me straight in the eye and delivered the ultimate lie. He said he had to marry Diane on paper. He insisted it was a purely legal maneuver, a desperate strategy to shield my wife and my son from the federal prosecutors. He placed a hand over his heart and swore to me that he did it all to save my family. Diane stepped forward, grabbing my trembling hand across the counter. She squeezed my fingers tightly, forcing more fake tears to spill down her cheeks. She told me they had absolutely no other choice. She said the lawyers told them it was the only way to survive the fallout of my conviction. She cried that Martin had kept Jason and her from starving during the darkest years of their lives. I looked down at her perfectly manicured nails and then glanced back at the $1,000,000 art hanging on the wall. Starving, I thought. They were living like royalty on stolen money while feeding me a fabricated narrative of survival. I kept my face blank, nodding slowly, as if I was struggling to process their immense sacrifice. Martin then reached down and pulled a thick leather briefcase from the floor. He placed it on the marble island and unzipped it with a sharp, crisp sound. He told me that things were highly complicated now, but he promised he would never let me down. He pulled a thick stack of stapled papers from the briefcase and slid the contract across the smooth marble island toward me. I stared at the thick stack of stapled papers resting on the smooth marble island, just inches from my folded hands. The cover page bore a sleek minimalist logo that I did not recognize. It was a stylized globe wrapped in a metallic silver font. I stared at the embossed letters, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The company name printed at the top of the contract was Cole Global. My name had been completely erased. The legacy I had built from the ground up, the $42 million logistics empire that bore my family name, had been quietly rebranded and claimed by the man standing across from me. I kept my face perfectly neutral, letting my eyes dart across the page as if I was struggling to comprehend the complex legal jargon. Martin leaned forward, placing his elbows on the cold counter. He spoke in a slow, measured tone, like a teacher explaining a difficult concept to a slow child. He told me that he had spent the last 2 weeks negotiating with the board of directors to secure a comfortable arrangement for my return. He claimed that the board was extremely hesitant to offer any financial support to a convicted felon, but he had personally vouched for me. He pointed a manicured finger to a paragraph near the bottom of the first page. He explained that the document was a consulting retainer. He said the company was prepared to pay me $5,000 a month for the rest of my life. He promised that the money would be deposited directly into a secure offshore account, shielded from any federal inquiries. All I had to do, he explained softly, was move to a quiet, out-of-state location and enjoy a peaceful retirement. He smiled, a sickening display of false generosity, and told me that I had earned the right to finally rest. I slowly reached out and picked up the heavy document. My hands were rough and calloused from 9 years of prison labor, a stark contrast to the crisp white premium paper. I let my fingers tremble just slightly, maintaining the illusion of a broken, exhausted old man. I flipped to the second page, squinting my eyes as if the text was blurry. But my mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. I scanned the fine print with the practiced efficiency of a chief executive officer. It did not take long to see the true nature of Martin's generous offer. The document was not a consulting retainer. It was an ironclad, incredibly restrictive non-disclosure agreement. The clauses were explicitly clear. If I accepted the $5,000 a month, I would be legally bound to never speak about the company, its origins, or its current leadership. I would be prohibited from contacting any former clients, employees, or board members. Furthermore, a highly specific clause buried on page 4 stated that I forfeited any and all future claims to my original founder shares. It was a gag order designed to legally paralyze me. They were offering me pennies to surrender an empire worth tens of millions of dollars. I kept my breathing shallow and uneven, acting as though the legal terminology was overwhelming my fragile state of mind. I looked up at Martin, letting my lower lip quiver. I asked him why the contract required me to leave the state. I asked why I could not just stay here in Chicago near the company I had started. Before Martin could formulate another lie, Jason sighed heavily and shifted his weight on the leather barstool. He looked at me with an expression that dripped with condescending pity. He leaned in, adopting a tone of fake, agonizing sympathy. He told me that I needed to be realistic about my current situation. He said that the business world had moved on since my conviction, and that corporate compliance was stricter than ever. Jason looked me directly in the eyes and reminded me that I had a federal felony on my permanent record. He said that Cole Global was currently bidding on massive government contracts, and the military had absolute zero tolerance for any association with corporate fraud. He explained that if the media or the federal auditors found out that the original disgraced founder was hanging around the corporate headquarters, the government would instantly cancel every single active contract. He said the resulting scandal would bankrupt the entire company overnight. Jason shook his head, placing a comforting hand over his heart. He told me that I needed to swallow my pride and accept the reality of my circumstances. He said that Martin was doing me a massive favor by fighting the board to get me this money. He urged me to just take the cash, sign the papers, and go live a quiet, comfortable life down in Florida. He said it was the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Diane nodded vigorously from across the kitchen, wiping away her fabricated tears. She pleaded with me to listen to our son. She said they just wanted me to be safe and happy, far away from the stress of the corporate world. I looked at the three of them, absorbing the absolute magnitude of their deception. My best friend, my wife, and the boy I had raised were standing in my kitchen, casually orchestrating my permanent exile. They were completely convinced that they held all the power. They believed I was too weak, too poor, and too frightened to challenge their authority. I let a long, heavy silence fill the room. I slowly lowered the contract to the counter, letting out a defeated, hollow sigh. I reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the polished silver pen Martin had placed next to the document. I held the pen over the signature line, letting it hover there for 10 agonizing seconds. Martin held his breath, his eyes glued to the tip of the pen, silently praying for his theft to become legally binding. Just as the ink was about to touch the paper, I stopped. I let the pen slip from my fingers, letting it clatter loudly against the marble. I rubbed my eyes, pressing the heels of my palms into my face. I told them that my vision was too blurry from the long bus ride, and that the harsh kitchen lights were giving me a terrible migraine. I forced a tired, apologetic smile. I told Martin that I was incredibly grateful for his generosity, and that I fully intended to accept his offer. I picked up the printed $5,000 check he had left beside the contract and carefully folded it into my breast pocket. I grabbed the thick legal document, holding it tightly to my chest. I told them I just needed to take it with me to read over in the morning when my mind was clear and my eyes were rested. I promised I would sign every page and mail it directly to his downtown office before noon tomorrow. Martin frowned, a flash of irritation crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a supportive nod. He patted my shoulder and told me to take all the time I needed. Jason offered another stiff, awkward goodbye, while Diane kissed my cheek, whispering that she loved me. I picked up my cheap green canvas duffel bag. I opened the door and stepped out. The act was finally over. I walked down the long, sweeping asphalt driveway of the estate, feeling the icy rain continue to soak through the thin fabric of my suit. The moment the massive wrought iron gates closed behind me with a heavy metallic thud, I let out a long, shuddering breath. The frail, broken persona I had just spent the last hour perfectly executing completely vanished. My spine straightened, my shoulders squared, and the trembling in my hands ceased entirely. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a man who knew exactly what he needed to do next. I did not look back at the glowing windows of the mansion. I had seen enough to know that the life I had left behind 9 years ago was nothing but a carefully orchestrated illusion. I walked for nearly 2 miles through the quiet, wealthy neighborhoods until I reached the main commercial road. I waited at a glowing bus stop shelter blending into the dark night until a late transit bus arrived. I paid my fare with the few wrinkled bills the prison had given me and sat in the back corner. I rode the bus out of the affluent suburbs, watching the pristine lawns fade into the grittier industrial outskirts of the city. I got off in Skokie, an area filled with faded strip malls and flickering neon signs. I walked for another 20 minutes until I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a rundown single-story motel sitting right off the highway. The glowing red vacancy sign hummed with a low, irritating buzz. I walked into the cramped lobby, which smelled heavily of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine disinfectant. The clerk behind the thick plexiglass window barely looked up from his small television screen as I asked for a room. I paid $60 in cash, securing a key attached to a heavy plastic fob. My room was at the very end of the dimly lit outdoor corridor. I unlocked the thin wooden door and stepped inside. The room was tiny and depressing. The wallpaper was peeling at the corners, and the faded floral bedspread looked like it had not been washed in a decade. But to me, it was absolutely perfect. It was a secure, anonymous sanctuary where nobody would ever think to look for the former chief executive officer of a logistics empire. I locked the deadbolt, fastened the security chain, and threw my cheap canvas duffel bag onto the mattress. I took off my soaked jacket and draped it over a rickety wooden chair. The first order of business was securing untraceable capital. When the sun finally rose the next morning, I walked to a busy local bank branch right down the street. I approached the teller and presented the $5,000 check Martin had given me along with the temporary release identification the state had provided. Because the check was drawn from a premium corporate account, the teller verified the funds immediately. I walked out of this bank with $5,000 in crisp $100 bills securely tucked into my pocket. I immediately went to a massive electronics retail store a few blocks away. I paid cash for a cheap, entirely untraceable laptop, a prepaid mobile internet hotspot, and a generic burner telephone. I did not want to leave any digital footprints. I returned to my dingy motel room, locked the door behind me, and set up my new equipment on the small scratched wooden desk pushed against the far wall. I opened the laptop and connected to the prepaid internet network. My heart beat with a steady, rhythmic thud. It was time to start digging through the public records. Martin had looked me right in the eye and swore that he married Diane purely to protect the estate from the federal asset forfeiture. He claimed it was a desperate last-minute legal maneuver enacted only after I was indicted. That was the foundational pillar of his entire defense. I accessed the county property registry database. I typed in the address of my Highland Park estate. The system took a few seconds to load the extensive historical documentation of the property. I scrolled past the original purchase deed from 20 years ago, moving straight to the transaction history surrounding the time of my sudden arrest. What I saw on the glowing screen made my blood run entirely cold. According to the official county, the entire estate had not been transferred to Martin during my trial. It had not been shielded during the chaotic aftermath of my indictment. The property had been quietly and legally transferred into an irrevocable blind trust 14 months before the federal agents ever knocked on my office doors. 14 months. I sat back in the creaking wooden chair, staring at the undeniable date stamped on the digital document. My mind raced, connecting the terrifying dots. If they transferred the house over a year before my arrest, that meant they knew the raid was coming. They had meticulously shielded their primary assets long before the federal government even opened their investigation into my company. This was not a panicked rescue mission to save a grieving family. This was a highly calculated, cold-blooded corporate coup engineered by the people sleeping in my bed. I closed the property registry and opened a new search window. I typed the name Cole Global into the search engine. I needed to see exactly what Martin had done with the logistics empire I had sacrificed my life to build. The search results flooded the screen, and the scale of his success was absolutely staggering. Martin had not merely kept the firm afloat during a period of crisis. He had aggressively expanded it into a titan of the industry. The company had grown exponentially, opening new branches in Europe and Asia. But the real shock came when I clicked on a recent press release featured on a major financial news website. The headline announced that Cole Global had just secured a historic $150 million contract with the United States Department of Defense. I read through the detailed article, my eyes scanning the technical specifics of the massive government deal. The journalist praised Cole Global for its revolutionary hyper-efficient supply chain routing software. The article quoted Martin, who proudly claimed he had spent years developing this flawless proprietary algorithm that could predict and optimize global shipping routes in real time. I clenched my jaw tight. It was my algorithm. I had spent 4 agonizing years coding that exact software architecture in my private office. I had finalized the base code just weeks before I was arrested. Martin had stolen my life work, slapped his name on the patent, and used it to secure $150 million in federal funding. I was standing on stages receiving awards and living as a billionaire, all while profiting off the sheer genius of a man he had intentionally buried in a concrete cell. He was throwing me a pathetic $5,000 monthly allowance, expecting me to quietly disappear while he cashed huge checks from the military using my stolen intellectual property. I grabbed the cheap prepaid burner phone from the desk, my fingers moving with swift, calculated precision. I needed to verify the exact timeline of their financial restructuring and test the absolute weakest link in their entire deceptive chain. I quickly texted my son Jason to meet me for private coffee. The next morning, I walked out of the subway station, blending into the rush hour crowd. My cheap suit was wrinkled, and I kept my posture deliberately hunched, projecting the image of a defeated old man. I was heading to a diner located near the skyscraper that housed Cole Global. I had texted my own son Jason late last night, asking him to meet me for a quick coffee. I told him I needed to see him alone before I signed the legal paperwork and left the city. When I pushed through the glass doors, the smell of roasted coffee beans filled the warm air. The restaurant was packed with corporate executives. I spotted Jason immediately. He was sitting in a secluded booth checking his smartphone. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie that cost more than my entire motel room. He looked highly confident and entirely out of place, sitting across from a man who looked like he had crawled out of a gutter. I walked over and slid into the worn leather seat. Jason looked up, locking his phone and sliding it face down. He forced a tight smile. He did not lean forward to hug me. He did not ask how I slept. He simply nodded and asked if I wanted to order breakfast. I shook my head slowly, keeping my eyes fixed on my calloused hands. I told him I was not hungry and that my stomach was still adjusting to real food after surviving on prison rations for nearly a decade. I let out a heavy sigh, playing the role of the guilt-ridden father. I looked up at him, letting a profound sadness wash over my face. I apologized. I told him how incredibly sorry I was for missing the most important years of his life. I spoke softly, my voice cracking perfectly, as I talked about missing his college graduation. I told him my greatest agony was knowing I had left him and his mother unprotected when the government froze my bank accounts. Jason shifted uncomfortably. The raw emotion in my voice was clearly making him anxious. He signaled the waitress and ordered a black coffee, avoiding my direct gaze. He cleared his throat and adjusted his suit jacket. He told me I did not need to apologize anymore. He said the past was firmly in the past, and dwelling on the raid was not going to help anyone move forward. He insisted he and Diane had survived the fallout and that things had worked out for the best. I nodded slowly, letting a look of immense gratitude spread across my face. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table. I kept my tone casual and entirely unthreatening. I asked him how he had managed to pay for his elite university tuition after the federal agents seized my assets. I reminded him the government had frozen the college funds, and Diane had no independent income. I looked at him with naive eyes, asking how they survived those terrifying months before Martin finalized the legal merger. Jason tensed immediately. His jaw tightened, and he quickly broke eye contact, looking out the window. The defensive shift in his body language was incredibly revealing. He picked up a small sugar packet and began tearing it into tiny pieces. He let out an irritated breath and told me I was overthinking the timeline. He spoke quickly, his words clipped and rushed. He said I did not need to worry about the financial details because Martin had handled everything. Jason looked back at me, his face hardening with a flash of arrogant annoyance, and he finally slipped up. He said, "Martin set up my private trust fund when I turned 18, Dad. We were fine. You don't need to stress about it." The waitress arrived, placing a steaming mug of black coffee in front of him. I stared at the dark liquid, feeling the world slow down around me. Jason had just turned 28 years old last month. If Martin had established his private trust fund when he turned 18, that meant the offshore accounts were fully funded a decade ago. It meant Martin was funneling millions into an irrevocable trust for my son 2 full years before the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided my corporate office. 2 full years while I was still sitting in the chief executive chair working 80-hour weeks to build the company. The remaining fragmented pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed into place inside my mind. This was not a panicked emergency rescue operation executed by a loyal friend to save a destitute family from the crushing weight of the federal government. This was a meticulously planned, premeditated corporate coup. Martin had deliberately siphoned my money to secure my family's loyalty long before he triggered the federal investigation that buried me. They had been plotting my total destruction while eating at my dinner table. I kept my expression perfectly blank. I did not let the violent storm of realization show in my eyes. I simply nodded, whispering a quiet thank you. Jason let out a frustrated sigh, clearly eager to end this uncomfortable meeting. He tapped his expensive watch and told me he had an important board meeting in 20 minutes. He demanded to know if I brought the signed non-disclosure agreement. He said Martin was waiting for the paperwork so he could legally authorize the first wire transfer. He held out his hand, expecting me to hand over my unconditional surrender. I looked at his outstretched hand. I let out an embarrassed chuckle and shook my head. I told him I was terribly sorry. I explained that I had been reviewing the complex document in my motel room last night, and my hands were shaking so badly I accidentally knocked over my coffee mug. I lied flawlessly, claiming the hot liquid had completely ruined the signature pages. I told him the ink had smeared everywhere and the contract was unreadable. I apologized profusely, promising that if he could just print me a fresh copy, I would gladly sign it right away. Jason slammed his hand down on the table, his face flushing with furious frustration. He muttered a sharp curse under his breath, glaring at me with undisguised contempt. He called me a clumsy, useless old man, practically spitting the words across the table. He stood up abruptly, throwing a $20 bill onto the table to cover his untouched coffee. He told me to stay at my pathetic motel and that he would send a courier with a new copy of the agreement before noon. He ordered me not to leave the room, and he stormed out without looking back. I sat alone in the booth, watching my son disappear into the morning crowd. The fake, apologetic smile instantly vanished from my face. My jaw locked with a terrifying absolute certainty. I reached into the interior pocket of my cheap gray suit jacket. I pulled out the untraceable prepaid burner phone I purchased yesterday. I unlocked the device and stared at the blank dial pad. I had uncovered the undeniable proof of their premeditated conspiracy. Now I needed the ammunition to utterly destroy them. I dialed the secure, unlisted number of the only man I could trust to help me burn this empire to the ground. The line connected after 3 long rings. The voice on the other end was gruff, gravelly, and heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had seen too many innocent people lose their lives to a broken system. I did not bother with pleasantries. I simply told Michael Gallagher that my sentence had been cut short and I needed to see him immediately. There was a brief, stunned silence on the line before he gave me an address for a dive bar on the south side of the city. He told me to come alone and make absolutely sure I was not being followed. Michael Gallagher had been my primary defense attorney a decade ago. He was a brilliant, cynical bulldog of a lawyer who never took a case unless he believed in it. During my trial, he had fought like an absolute madman, aggressively challenging every single piece of evidence the federal prosecutors brought to the stand. Mike had always sworn that the prosecution's financial paper trail was entirely too clean. He argued that the offshore wire transfers had been perfectly curated, neatly packaged with a bow to guarantee my conviction. But the judge did not listen. The jury did not care. When the guilty verdict was handed down, it broke Mike. The sheer injustice of my sentence forced him into an early, bitter retirement. He lost his license to practice law shortly after spiraling into a deep depression fueled by cheap whiskey and lingering guilt. But I knew that beneath the tired exterior, the brilliant legal mind was still wide awake, waiting for a chance to finally set the record straight. I walked into the dimly lit tavern 2 hours later. The air smelled of stale beer and damp wood. The place was nearly empty, save for a few regulars hunched over the polished mahogany bar. I spotted Mike sitting in a dark, secluded booth in the very back. His hair was completely gray now, and deep lines of stress etched his face, but his sharp, perceptive eyes had not lost their intense focus. I slid into the cracked leather seat across from him. He did not say a word. He just stared at me, taking in the cheap suit and the physical toll 9 years of hard labor had taken on my body. He pushed a glass of whiskey across the scratched wooden table. I ignored the drink. I unzipped my canvas duffel bag and pulled out the thick stack of printed documents I had gathered from the public registry. I slid the papers across the table. I told him to look at the property transfer deeds and the timeline of Jason's irrevocable trust fund. I sat back and watched as the retired hound caught the scent of the hunt. Mike pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket and began to examine the documents. The bar was silent, except for the low hum of the neon beer signs buzzing against the dirty brick wall. For 10 minutes, Mike cross-referenced the dates on the trust fund with the dates of the initial federal investigation. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the pages. Slowly, the heavy exhaustion in his posture began to vanish. His shoulders tightened and his breathing grew shallow. A terrifying, brilliant spark of realization ignited in his eyes. He slowly lowered the papers to the table and took off his glasses. He looked at me, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute vindication and profound horror. He said they had completely set me up. He explained how the pieces fit together with sickening perfection. He reminded me of the mysterious offshore accounts that the federal agents had traced directly back to my name. During the trial, the prosecution proved that the accounts were accessed using the private internet protocol address originating from my own home. My defense had always been that my home network was compromised by an outside hacker. Mike tapped the table with a heavy finger. He told me there was no anonymous hacker. He said Martin was the one who secretly opened the offshore accounts, but Diane was the one who provided the digital access from inside my house. She had given him the keys to the kingdom. They had worked together to route the stolen cartel money through my personal servers, intentionally leaving a glowing digital footprint for the federal agents to find. The sheer malice of their partnership hung in the air between us. They had weaponized my own home against me. But as the adrenaline of the discovery settled, Mike leaned back in the booth and let out a long, frustrated sigh. He rubbed his face with his rough hands and pointed out a massive, insurmountable problem. He said that having a plausible theory and possessing circumstantial motives were completely useless in a federal court. To overturn a conviction and indict a billionaire like Martin Cole, we needed undeniable concrete proof. We needed the original source code of the initial wire transfers, and we needed the deleted internal emails sent between Martin and Diane from 11 years ago. We needed the digital smoking gun. I told him we could just hire a hacker to breach the company network. I reminded him that I still knew the foundational architecture of the security software. But Mike shook his head grimly. He explained that Martin was extremely paranoid about cybersecurity after he took over. 3 years ago, Martin had completely restructured the corporate infrastructure. He took all of the highly sensitive legacy data, the foundational financial records, and the original email servers, and he moved them entirely offline. Mike said the files we needed were stored on a localized cold storage server locked inside Martin's private executive suite on the 38th floor. The server had absolutely no external internet connection. It was completely air-gapped from the rest of the world. No hacker could breach it from the outside. The only way to access that data was to physically sit at Martin's desk, bypass the biometric security, and manually plug a hard drive directly into the terminal. Mike looked at me with a grim, defeated expression. He said the building was a heavily guarded fortress. There were armed security patrols, facial recognition scanners in the elevators, and 24-hour surveillance cameras covering every single inch of the executive floor. He told me it was a total suicide mission. He said if I was caught anywhere near that building, I would violate the terms of my release and be sent right back to a maximum security cell for the rest of my natural life. He urged me to take the $5,000 a month and just walk away. He said some battles were simply impossible to win. I sat in the dark booth listening to his warnings. I looked down at my rough, scarred hands. I thought about Diane kissing Martin by the fireplace. I thought about Jason laughing at my expense drinking scotch in the mansion I paid for. I thought about the 9 years of my life they had stolen, the cold nights in a concrete cell, the sheer humiliation of being branded a criminal, while the true thieves lived like kings. I let a cold, terrifying calm wash over my mind. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the sticky wooden table, bringing my face incredibly close to Mike. I looked directly into his tired, cynical eyes. I told him that I did not care about the security patrols or the biometric scanners. I told him that I knew every single inch of that 40-story skyscraper because I was the man who had personally designed its original security layout 15 years ago. I knew the blind spots. I knew the maintenance schedules. And I knew exactly how to bypass the electronic locks without triggering a single alarm. I did not ask for his permission, and I did not ask for his advice. I simply gave him an order. I told him to reach out to his old underworld contacts in the city and procure me a flawless, untraceable fake identification card. I told him to get me a janitorial uniform and a fabricated background check that could pass a cursory corporate screening. I needed a completely invisible identity. I stared at him with absolute unwavering resolve, ignoring the sheer danger of what we were about to do. I told him I was going back to work. The fear in his eyes slowly vanished, replaced by a dangerous, familiar spark of rebellion. He nodded slowly, realizing that I was absolutely serious. Mike did not waste time. He reached out to a contact he had defended years ago, a man who managed the night shift labor contracts for half the commercial high-rises in the downtown financial district. The man owed Mike a massive favor, and within 3 days my new identity was completely finalized. I was no longer Thomas Barrett, the disgraced and convicted former chief executive officer. I was Arthur Pendleton, a 70-year-old widower with a clean, unremarkable background check and a desperate need for minimum wage employment. I stood on the sidewalk outside the towering 40-story glass and steel skyscraper, looking up at the illuminated logo of Coal Global shining against the dark night sky. I had purchased this exact plot of land 20 years ago. I had stood in the muddy construction site, wearing a hard hat, personally reviewing the architectural blueprints for every single floor. Now I was walking through the revolving glass doors through the employee service entrance, wearing baggy navy blue coveralls with a cheap plastic name tag pinned to my chest. The irony was not lost on me, but I did not let it break my focus. I clocked in at the basement security desk, handing my fabricated identification card to a bored guard who barely glanced at my face before handing me a set of service keys. For the next 7 nights, I became a completely invisible man. I was assigned to the upper executive levels tasked with emptying trash bins, vacuuming the heavy carpets, and scrubbing the porcelain sinks in the employee restrooms. It was a grueling, physically agonizing routine for a man of my age. My back throbbed constantly from bending over, and my hands, already rough from a decade of prison labor, blistered under the harsh industrial cleaning chemicals. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological test of my own ego. I needed them to ignore me. I needed them to believe I was absolutely harmless. While the corporate staff viewed me as a mindless drone, I was meticulously analyzing every single detail of the building. I memorized the exact shift changes of the armed security guards. I timed their patrol routes down to the precise second, noting when they took their coffee breaks and when they monitored the camera feeds in the basement control room. I paid special attention to the 38th floor. That was the elite executives, the heavily guarded sanctuary, where Martin Cole had established his private office. The entire floor was restricted accessible only by a programmed keycard. But Martin's personal office was secured by something much more formidable. He had installed a state-of-the-art biometric retinal scanner right next to his solid mahogany door. Even if I managed to steal a master keycard from the head of security, I would never be able to bypass the retinal lock. But Martin had made a critical, arrogant mistake. When he took over the company, he upgraded the digital security interfaces, but he did not rebuild the physical infrastructure of the skyscraper. He did not know the hidden intricacies of the building's original design. When I contracted the construction of this high-rise 20 years ago, I insisted on implementing a fail-safe mechanism for the localized ventilation framework. There was a critical design flaw embedded deeply within the primary heating and cooling system. There was a manual high-voltage override panel concealed inside the main utility closet on the 38th floor. If you flipped the primary breaker in a specific sequence, the system would simulate a catastrophic electrical surge. To prevent the entire floor from catching fire, the local breaker would automatically reboot the localized power grid. During that forced reboot, the biometric scanners on the executive doors would briefly drop their magnetic locks and default to an open state for exactly 5 seconds. 5 seconds was all I needed to slip inside. I spent the rest of the week rehearsing the precise sequence of movements in my head. I mapped out the exact distance between the utility closet and Martin's office door. I counted my footsteps, calculating the absolute optimal speed required to reach the heavy wooden door before the biometric scanner rebooted and the magnetic locks engaged once more. I could not afford a single miscalculation. If I triggered the override and failed to reach the door in time, the security system would immediately register a localized power anomaly and alert the basement control room. The guards would swarm the 38th floor within 2 minutes, and my fake identity would not save me from a federal trespassing charge. Everything had to be executed with absolute surgical precision. The opportunity finally presented itself on a rainy Tuesday night. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and the downpour pounded against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the skyscraper. The brutal weather had cleared out the usual late-night executives who stayed behind to finish reports. The 38th floor was completely silent, bathed in the eerie pale glow of the emergency exit signs. I stood at the end of the long carpeted hallway, gripping the thick plastic handle of my cleaning cart. My heart hammered against my ribs with a heavy rhythmic throb, pumping pure adrenaline through my tired veins. I looked at the black dome of the security camera mounted above the elevator bank. I knew the guard in the basement monitoring room was currently on his scheduled 15-minute meal break. The camera was recording, but nobody was watching the live feed. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. I pushed the heavy cleaning cart forward, the small wheels squeaking softly against the polished floor. I moved past the dark, empty cubicles, heading straight for the unmarked utility closet, located just 15 yards away from Martin Cole's private office. I reached into the deep pocket of my navy blue coveralls and pulled out a heavy metal wrench. I stepped up to the closet door, my eyes fixed on the heavy biometric lock securing the empire that had been stolen from me. The years of waiting, the years of suffering in a concrete cell, and the unbearable agony of betrayal had all led to this exact moment. It was time. The air inside the small utility closet on the 38th floor was stifling and smelled faintly of ozone and heated dust. I stood in the cramped space staring at the massive gray metal panel that controlled the localized heating and ventilation system for the executive suite. My heart pounded a heavy rhythm against my ribs. I reached out with a trembling hand and gripped the heavy black plastic switch of the primary breaker. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, visualizing the exact sequence I had engineered 20 years ago. I pulled the switch down with a loud metallic clack. The low hum of the ventilation fans immediately died out. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2. I threw the secondary bypass switch upward. 3, 4. The system registered the simulated electrical surge, and I heard the faint, distant sound of the magnetic relays in the hallway tripping. I shoved the heavy closet door open and pushed myself out into the corridor. I had exactly 5 seconds to cross the 15 yards to Martin Cole's private office. I forced my 70-year-old legs to move faster than they had in a decade. My heavy rubber work boots pounded silently against the thick, plush carpet. I kept my eyes completely locked on the biometric retinal scanner mounted next to the towering solid mahogany door. The small circular light on the scanner was normally a solid, unforgiving red. As I closed the distance, the light flickered wildly, cycling through an error sequence as the local power grid rebooted. I reached the door just as the light turned a solid, vibrant green. I grabbed the heavy brass handle, twisted it downward, and shoved my weight against the wood. The door clicked open. I threw myself inside the dark office and pulled the door shut behind me, listening as the heavy magnetic deadbolt instantly locked back into place. I stood in the pitch-black room, leaning my forehead against the cool wood of the door, gasping for air. I had made it inside. The executive office was enormous, bathed only in the faint ambient glow of the city streetlights shining through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I turned around and looked at the space that used to belong to me. The room was decorated with modern minimalist furniture, but sitting in the very center was the massive custom-built oak desk I had imported directly from Italy for the 10th anniversary of the company. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, solid and imposing. I walked over to the desk and sat down in the high-backed leather executive chair. It felt surreal to sit at this desk again, dressed in the cheap navy blue coveralls of a night shift janitor. I reached underneath the edge of the desk and pressed the concealed power button for the localized cold storage terminal. The hidden computer tower hummed to life with a quiet whir. A large curved monitor embedded into the surface of the desk illuminated the dark room with a harsh, bright blue light. A simple login prompt appeared on the screen, demanding a secure biometric scan and a complex alphanumeric password. Martin was incredibly paranoid about outside hackers, but he was also fundamentally arrogant. He had locked this terminal away from the internet, assuming that physical isolation was the ultimate security measure. But he had not bothered to rewrite the foundational operating system. He had simply layered his new security protocols on top of the original architecture I had built. I placed my hands on the sleek wireless keyboard. I bypassed the main login screen entirely by entering a series of complex keystrokes that accessed the primary command terminal. A black screen with green text appeared. I typed in the master backdoor override password I had coded into the system over a decade ago. It was a long, convoluted sequence of numbers and letters known only to me. I pressed the enter key. The screen blinked, and the security firewall instantly collapsed. I had full administrative access to the entire localized server. I reached into my deep pocket and pulled out the high-speed encrypted solid-state cloning drive Mike had provided. I leaned forward and plugged the small device directly into the hidden data port underneath the monitor. The computer recognized the external drive immediately. I rapidly navigated through the deep hidden directories of the server. I found the massive archive containing all the original source code for the proprietary logistics algorithm, along with the complete unedited internal email database from the year leading up to my federal indictment. I highlighted the entire directory and initiated the transfer. A small loading window popped up on the screen, displaying a green progress bar. The estimated time for the complete data transfer was 4 minutes. I sat back in the leather chair watching the percentage slowly climb. 10%. 20%. The silence in the office was deafening, broken only by the steady drumming of the icy rain against the glass windows behind me. The progress bar hit 40%, then 50%. I kept my eyes glued to the numbers, silently urging the machine to move faster. The bar crept up to 60%. Suddenly, the absolute silence of the 38th floor was shattered. I heard the unmistakable heavy thud of tactical boots walking down the carpeted hallway outside. My blood turned entirely to ice. The footsteps were deliberate, slow, and methodical. The night supervisor was conducting an unscheduled security sweep of the executive level. The guard was checking every single door, making sure the biometric locks were fully engaged. The footsteps were getting closer, echoing loudly through the thick wooden door of Martin's office. I had less than 20 seconds before the guard reached this room. Panic surged through my chest, but my survival instincts took over. I could not pull the hard drive out of the terminal. If I interrupted the cloning process now, the data would corrupt, and I would leave behind a digital footprint that Martin's security team would find in the morning. I reached forward and aggressively pressed the power button on the monitor, killing the bright blue light and plunging the office back into total darkness. I dropped to my hands and knees, ignoring the sharp, agonizing pain shooting through my old joints. I scrambled underneath the massive Italian oak desk, pressing my back flat against the cold interior wooden panel. I pulled my knees tightly into my chest, wrapping my arms around my legs, and tried to make myself as small as physically possible. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside the office door. I held my breath, clamping my jaw completely shut so my teeth would not chatter. I heard the guard jiggle the heavy brass handle. The magnetic deadbolt held firm. But then I heard the faint beep of a master override keycard being scanned. The biometric lock chirped, and the heavy door swung slowly open. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight instantly cut through the dark office. The bright, blinding white light swept across the far wall, illuminating the expensive artwork and the leather guest chairs. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself deeper into the cramped space beneath the desk. The guard walked slowly into the room. I could hear his heavy breathing and the rustle of his thick uniform fabric. The beam of the flashlight swept across the top of the oak desk, moving down toward the floor. The piercing light illuminated the carpet, moving closer and closer to where I was hiding. The bright beam stopped just inches away from the tip of my heavy rubber work boots. I remained completely motionless, frozen in pure terror. A single drop of cold sweat rolled down the side of my face. If the guard took one more step forward, if he angled the flashlight just a fraction of an inch lower, he would see me. My entire life, my freedom, and my absolute revenge hinged on this single agonizing moment. The heavy silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the guard let out a low, tired grunt. He turned around the beam of the flashlight, sweeping away from the desk and back toward the hallway. He walked out of the office, pulling the heavy mahogany door shut behind him. The magnetic lock engaged with a loud final click. I let out a long, silent breath, my entire body trembling with the massive release of adrenaline. I waited for another 2 minutes, listening, until the sound of his footsteps completely faded away down the corridor. I slowly crawled out from under the desk, wincing as my stiff knees popped. I reached up and turned the monitor back on. The green progress bar was sitting at exactly 100%. The transfer was complete. I safely ejected the solid-state drive and slipped it deep into the interior pocket of my coveralls. I turned off the terminal, wiping down the keyboard and the desk surface with the sleeve of my uniform to ensure I left no fingerprints. I walked quietly to the door, bypassed the interior lock, and scout into the dimly lit hallway. I grabbed the handle of my plastic cleaning cart and began pushing it toward the service elevator. I kept my head down, resuming the pathetic posture of an invisible janitor. But as I rode the elevator onto the basement, a fierce, triumphant smile spread across my face. I was walking out of this building with 11 years of devastating secrets safely tucked inside my pocket. The heavy steel door of Michael Gallagher's basement office groaned as I pushed it open. The space was thick with the acrid scent of stale tobacco and old paper. Mike was sitting exactly where I had left him hours ago, surrounded by towering stacks of legal textbooks and empty coffee mugs. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes widening as he saw me walk into the dim light. I did not say a word. I reached into the deep pocket of my damp navy blue coveralls, pulled out the encrypted solid-state drive, and placed it firmly on the center of his cluttered wooden desk. A slow, predatory smile spread across Mike's exhausted face. He cleared the scattered documents with a swift sweep of his arm and pulled a heavy, reinforced laptop from a locked metal drawer. He explained that the machine was completely air-gapped, meaning its wireless network cards had been physically removed to ensure nothing could transmit our findings back to Martin Cole's security team. I pulled up a folding chair and sat beside him. My muscles ached fiercely, and the adrenaline that had fueled my escape from the skyscraper was rapidly fading, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. But I could not sleep. I needed to see the truth. Mike plugged the drive into the secure terminal. A prompt appeared on the screen requesting the decryption key. I leaned forward and typed in the master override sequence. The system accepted the credentials, unlocking the vast hidden archives of Cole Global. We were looking at a massive digital graveyard containing over a decade of erased corporate history. Mike cracked his knuckles and immediately began writing a search script to filter the internal communications. He targeted the specific 12-month window leading up to my sudden arrest, isolating any direct correspondence between Martin's private executive address and Diane's personal email account. The search took several agonizing minutes. We sat in silence, watching the progress bar crawl across the glowing monitor. Finally, a list of 300 hidden messages populated the screen. Mike clicked on the very first email in the chronological sequence. It was dated 14 months before the federal raid. The subject line was blank. I read the text, feeling a cold, heavy stone drop into the pit of my stomach. It was an incredibly brief message from Diane to Martin. It contained a single attached file and a short note confirming that the installation was successful. Mike frowned, expertly extracting the attachment and running it through a localized diagnostic tool. He let out a sharp, bitter breath and rubbed the back of his neck. He told me the file was an executable payload for a highly sophisticated keylogger. Diane had secretly downloaded malicious surveillance software directly onto my private home computer. Every single time I logged into my secured banking portals from my home office, the keylogger captured my keystrokes and transmitted my master passwords straight to Martin. The sickening reality of their operation began to take shape right in front of my eyes. We opened the next batch of emails moving closer to the date of my federal indictment. The messages painted a flawless, horrifying picture of their corporate coup. Martin had used my stolen credentials to access my private offshore emergency accounts. He systematically routed millions of dollars of illicit cartel money through my personal servers, intentionally leaving a massive, undeniable digital footprint tied directly to my residential internet protocol address. He was not just stealing my wealth. He was meticulously framing me for international money laundering. Diane was his active, willing accomplice. She had provided him with my personal schedule, letting him know exactly when I would be out of the house so he could initiate the fraudulent transfers without triggering my immediate suspicion. They had weaponized the sanctity of my own home. They had turned my private sanctuary into a staging ground for my complete destruction. I sat rigidly in the folding chair, my hands gripping the edge of the desk, so tightly my knuckles turned entirely white. I thought about the thousands of nights I had spent lying awake in a concrete cell, agonizing over how the federal agents had built such a perfect case against me. I had blamed myself. I had agonized over invisible hackers and theoretical security breaches. But the enemy had been sleeping in my bed every single night. Mike continued to scroll through the decrypted inbox, his face growing paler with every passing second. He clicked on an email dated just 3 weeks before the Federal Bureau of Investigation kicked down my front door. The message was sent by Diane. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the words my wife had typed while I was sitting across the hall in our dining room. She wrote to Martin, telling him to make absolutely sure the federal prosecutor pursued the maximum possible sentence. She explicitly stated that if I received anything less than 5 years behind bars, I would eventually get out and launch a massive legal battle to reclaim my assets. She told Martin to make it 10. She demanded a decade of my life. She wanted me locked away in a cage long enough for her to completely liquidate my estate and disappear into her stolen luxury. Reading those words fundamentally destroyed the very last illusion I harbored about my marriage. The woman I had loved, the woman I had worked 80-hour weeks to provide for, did not just want my money. She wanted me dead in a cell. She had actively advocated for my prolonged suffering just to ensure she could keep her country club memberships and her imported sports cars. The profound, unfathomable cruelty of her request extinguished any lingering trace of mercy left inside my soul. The silence in the basement was suffocating. I felt completely hollowed out, as if a vital piece of my humanity had been surgically removed. But there was no time to mourn. Mike was still navigating through the complex directory of stolen files. He backed out of the email archive and opened a master folder containing Martin's private financial ledgers and personal documents. The screen was filled with hundreds of subfolders, most labeled with generic corporate acronyms. But as Mike scrolled down the alphabetical list, he suddenly stopped. His hand hovered over the computer mouse. He was staring at a hidden password-protected subfolder nestled at the very bottom of the directory. The folder was named J_med_records. Mike glanced at me, frowning. He asked why Martin would keep an encrypted directory of Jason's medical history on a corporate server. I shook my head, unable to comprehend it. Jason had his appendix removed in college, but nothing in his past warranted a classified vault. Mike ran a decryption program against the folder using our administrative access. The software hummed for 2 minutes before the lock broke. The folder opened, revealing a single document. Mike clicked on the file. It was clinical stationery from a Chicago laboratory. The printed medical document was dated exactly 28 years ago. I watched Mike's eyes dart across the text. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly gray. He swallowed hard and took his hand off the mouse. He pushed his chair back, putting distance between himself and the screen. He looked up at me with profound dread. He took a slow, deep breath and told me I needed to sit down for this. I pulled the folding metal chair out and lowered myself onto the hard plastic seat. I did not ask Michael Gallagher what he meant. I simply shifted my gaze toward the glowing monitor. The document displayed on the screen was a scanned copy of a heavily faded laboratory report. The letterhead belonged to a highly exclusive private medical clinic located in downtown Chicago. I scanned the top of the page, my eyes catching on the official timestamp, printed in the upper right corner. The test was conducted and finalized exactly 28 years ago. That was precisely 2 months after Diane had given birth to Jason. I felt a strange, detached numbness spreading through my chest as I read the demographic information filled out in the patient fields. The primary subject listed on the report was Jason Barrett, documented as a male infant. The secondary subject listed as the alleged father was not me. The name printed in bold black ink was Martin Cole. I stared at the two names sitting side by side on the clinical stationery. I scrolled down to the bottom of the scanned page where the final genetic analysis was summarized in a single devastating sentence. The report concluded that the probability of paternity was 99.9%. Jason was not my son. He never was. The boy I had proudly brought home from the hospital, the boy I had given my last name, was the biological product of a secret affair between my wife and my best friend. The timeline of their betrayal expanded dramatically in my mind, stretching far beyond the corporate coup that sent me to federal prison. Diane and Martin had not just conspired to steal my money 9 years ago. They had been sleeping together for 30 years. Their deception had started long before the logistics company ever became a massive success. They had built an entire parallel life right behind my back, using me as a convenient, hard-working shield to fund their luxurious, parasitic existence. The sheer suffocating weight of 3 decades of lies crushed down on my shoulders. A flood of cherished family memories rushed into my mind, but they were no longer beautiful. They were entirely tainted, poisoned by the vile reality of what I was looking at on the screen. I remembered staying awake for 3 consecutive nights, when Jason was a toddler, gently nursing his severe fevers, while Diane claimed she was too exhausted to help. I remembered standing in the expansive backyard of the Highland Park estate, spending countless summer afternoons, patiently teaching him how to throw a baseball. I had paid for his elite private schools, proudly sitting in the front row during his graduations, believing with all my heart that I was shaping the future of the Barrett family line. I had worked 80-hour weeks, sacrificing my own health and my own passions purely to ensure that my son would never have to struggle. While I was doing all of that, Martin and Diane were laughing at me. Martin would come over for Sunday barbecues, standing on my patio and drinking my expensive beer, secretly watching me raise his biological child. Diane would smile and kiss my cheek, playing the role of the loving mother, knowing perfectly well that the boy calling me dad shared absolutely none of my blood. Every single family portrait hanging on the walls of that mansion was a meticulously crafted lie. Every holiday dinner, every birthday celebration, every quiet evening spent sitting by the fireplace was a grotesque, parasitic deception. They had weaponized my deepest capacity for love and turned it into an instrument of my own subjugation. They had allowed me to finance Jason's entire privileged existence, waiting patiently until the logistics empire was worth tens of millions of dollars before they finally executed their ultimate plan to dispose of me. I sat motionless in the chair. Any normal man would have broken down. Any normal man would have buried his face in his hands and wept for the total destruction of his family. I expected the tears to come, but the tears never materialized. I did not cry. I did not gasp for air or scream out in agonizing sorrow. Instead, the profound, unbearable pain hit the absolute rock bottom of my soul and instantly froze. The warm, beating heart of Thomas Barrett, the dedicated husband and the loving father, completely stopped functioning in that exact moment. Something else woke up in its place. A chilling, terrifying sense of absolute clarity washed over my entire being. The lingering affection I held for the boy I raised was instantly eradicated. Jason was not an innocent victim in this. He had sat in the diner just hours ago, treating me like a pathetic burden, completely loyal to the man who had funded his lavish trust account with my stolen money. The magnitude of their collective theft was incomprehensible. They had not merely stolen my company, my assets, and my freedom. They had stolen my fatherhood. They had stolen my youth. Every drop of sweat I poured into building my legacy had been secretly harvested by parasites who viewed me as nothing more than a highly efficient machine. Diane's demand for a 10-year prison sentence finally made perfect sense. She did not just want me out of the way to enjoy the money. She needed me permanently silenced, so I would never have the opportunity to uncover the deeply buried medical records that proved her lifelong infidelity. She wanted me to die alone in a concrete cell, firmly believing that I had lost a loyal family, never realizing that I had been a pawn in her twisted game since the very beginning. I slowly placed my rough, calloused hand flat against the cool surface of the wooden desk. My mind was driven by a dark, relentless purpose. I realized that my entire perspective on justice had fundamentally shifted in the span of 5 minutes. An hour ago, my primary objective had been gathering enough evidence to clear my name, reclaim my stolen shares, and secure a comfortable financial future. I had harbored a small, foolish hope that perhaps I could somehow salvage a functional relationship with Jason. That pathetic, weak version of myself was officially dead. I no longer cared about simply getting my money back. Reclaiming my corporate empire was no longer the ultimate goal. It was merely the first necessary step in a much grander, far more destructive campaign. I turned my head and looked directly at Michael Gallagher. He sat perfectly and completely still in his worn leather desk chair, watching me with deep concern and quiet anticipation. He knew the devastating impact of the document on the screen, and he was waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces. I did not blink. I stared into his tired, cynical eyes with an expression of absolute, terrifying resolve. I kept my voice incredibly low, speaking with a smooth, dangerous calm that seemed to lower the temperature in the smoky basement office. I told him that I did not just want the company back anymore. I told him that I wanted to destroy them absolutely and completely. Michael Gallagher did not flinch at the icy conviction in my voice. He simply nodded, reached across his desk, and poured himself another glass of cheap whiskey. We did not leave his smoke-filled basement office for the next 72 hours. The air inside the room grew incredibly heavy and stale, thick, with the distinct smell of old legal paper and bitter, dark roasted coffee. Despite the grueling physical toll of our prolonged isolation, neither of us felt the slightest desire to sleep. My mind was operating on a level of pure, unadulterated focus that I had not experienced since my early days of building the company. We were no longer planning a standard civil lawsuit. Filing a conventional grievance in a corporate court would only give Martin Cole the opportunity to hire armies of expensive defense attorneys. It would allow him to drag the proceedings out for years while he quietly moved his stolen assets into untouchable offshore accounts. I did not want a quiet settlement. I wanted total, absolute annihilation. We needed a weapon that would bypass the traditional legal system entirely and strike directly at the very foundation of his illegitimate empire. I had spent 9 years locked in a cage stripped of my dignity, name, and freedom. I had endured the brutal, soul-crushing reality of maximum security confinement, while the architects of my misery slept comfortably in silk sheets. They thought they had successfully buried a weak, trusting fool. They did not realize that the immense pressure of their betrayal had forged me into something entirely different. We were going to dismantle their perfect lives piece by piece, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the horrifying realization of their own catastrophic failure. On the crisp morning of the second day, Mike pulled a heavy dust-covered cardboard storage box from the very bottom shelf of his filing closet. It contained the original foundational legal documents from the creation of our logistics firm over 30 years ago. I watched closely as he carefully smoothed out the yellowed typewritten pages of our initial limited liability company charter. I had meticulously drafted that specific document myself when Martin and I first went into business together. Back then, I was a young, highly cautious entrepreneur who desperately wanted to ensure that my intellectual property would always remain protected from corporate espionage or internal sabotage. I had insisted on weaving a highly specific draconian contingency clause deep into the dense corporate bylaws. It was a flawless fail-safe mechanism that seasoned corporate lawyers commonly refer to as a poison pill. Mike read the complex legal clause aloud, his gravelly voice growing remarkably stronger with every single word. The contractual stipulation was explicitly and undeniably clear. It stated that if any founding partner was ever convicted of corporate fraud, and it was later definitively proven with material evidence that the fraud was orchestrated, facilitated, or manipulated by another founding partner, the offending partner immediately and permanently forfeited their entire ownership stake. But the magnificent cruelty of the clause did not stop at corporate shares. It strictly mandated that the traitorous partner must surrender 100% of all personal assets, residential real estate, and private financial holdings tied to the wealth generated by the firm. Every single penny was to be immediately transferred back to the victimized partner, along with 3 decades of aggressive compounding interest. Because Martin had been so incredibly arrogant in his victory, he had never bothered to officially dissolve the original corporate charter. He had simply rebranded the company name to Cole Global, completely forgetting the foundational legal framework that still governed the massive enterprise. The lethal trap I had set 30 years ago was still perfectly active, and Martin was standing right in the absolute center of it. However, legally claiming the company assets was only half of the execution I had planned. I needed Martin rotting in a concrete cell. I pointed a steady finger to the digital press release we had uncovered earlier regarding the $150 million contract with the Department of Defense. I explained to Mike that the massive military contract was entirely serviced using my highly complex patented routing algorithm. Because Martin had formally claimed that intellectual property as his own original creation, in order to secure a massive government bid, he had crossed a terrifying, unforgivable legal line. He had not just stolen money from a private citizen. He had committed egregious, premeditated federal wire fraud against the United States military. Mike grinned a sharp, dangerous smile that completely transformed his exhausted face. He told me he knew exactly who to call. He reached across the desk for his secure telephone and dialed a direct, unlisted number. He was calling Special Agent Reynolds. Reynolds was the exact same federal investigator who had proudly slapped the cold steel handcuffs on my wrists 9 years ago. Over the long years, Reynolds had quietly expressed deep doubts about the pristine nature of the evidence in my case to his colleagues, harboring a profound professional guilt over how quickly the prosecution had pushed for a secure conviction. When Mike calmly explained the new digital evidence we had successfully extracted from the air-gapped server, including the malicious keylogger installation and the undeniable proof of stolen military intelligence, the seasoned agent did not hesitate for a single second. He was overwhelmingly eager to right the absolute greatest wrong of his long career. He promised to assemble a rapid response tactical team immediately and coordinate directly with our bold legal strategy. By the silent early dawn of the third day, our aggressive counteroffensive was flawlessly structured. We possessed the irrefutable digital evidence of the framed conviction, we controlled the lethal corporate poison pill, and we had the full, unwavering backing of the federal government. All we needed now was the perfect, highly visible stage to publicly drop the guillotine. Mike logged into the local high society pages on his encrypted laptop, to track Martin Cole's public corporate schedule. He found the perfect answer almost immediately. Martin was currently scheduled to host a massive, highly publicized black tie charity gala this coming Friday night at the historic Drake Hotel in downtown Chicago. The lavish, opulent event was ostensibly organized to celebrate his new military logistics contract, but the exclusive guest list revealed its true underlying purpose. Martin was planning to use the grand, glittering stage to officially introduce Jason to the corporate elite as the incoming chief operating officer and the sole future heir of the entire logistics empire. I stared at the promotional photograph glowing on the monitor. It showed Martin, Diane, and Jason smiling in their tailored evening wear. They looked like the perfect, untouchable American family. They were preparing to celebrate the culmination of their 30-year deception in front of the most powerful politicians, wealthy investors, and military generals in the city. It was the pinnacle of their arrogance. I stood up from the folding chair, my muscles stiff from the cold room, but my spirit feeling entirely unbroken. I looked at the photograph one last time, feeling a dark anticipation settle within my chest. They wanted a public coronation to validate their stolen kingdom. I was going to give them a public, completely devastating execution that they would remember for the rest of their miserable lives. Friday evening, inside the grand ballroom of the historic Drake Hotel radiated unimaginable opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast brilliant light over hundreds of Chicago's elite. State senators and military generals mingled across the polished marble floor. Waiters circulated carrying silver trays of premium champagne. A live jazz orchestra played an elegant melody. I stood in the shadowed alcove of the grand foyer, watching the event unfold through the crack of the mahogany doors. Martin Cole stood at the center podium on the raised main stage. He basked in the adoration of the crowd, adjusting his silk bow tie with a satisfied smile. He prepared to deliver his keynote address, ready to publicly claim credit for the military contract my stolen algorithm had secured. Sitting at the prestigious head table below the stage was Diane. Draped in a stunning velvet gown, her neck adorned with flawless diamonds my stolen money had purchased, she looked like a triumphant queen taking her throne. Standing nearby was Jason. Wearing a tailored tuxedo, he confidently schmoozed with older defense contractors. He laughed loudly, firmly, believing he was minutes away from being announced as the incoming chief operating officer. They looked completely untouchable. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was no longer wearing the damp gray suit the federal penitentiary had given me, and I was not wearing the cheap navy blue coveralls of an invisible night shift janitor. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored black tuxedo designed by Tom Ford. The sharp cut of the fabric accentuated my posture, making me look significantly more imposing than the broken old man they had laughed at in their kitchen. I adjusted my pristine silver cufflinks, feeling the heavy weight out of absolute authority return to my shoulders. Standing immediately to my right was Michael Gallagher. The retired bulldog of a defense attorney had traded his rumpled trench coat for a sharp charcoal suit. A fierce, predatory grin was etched onto his weathered face. He vibrated with the thrill of the incoming slaughter. Standing directly behind us, forming an impenetrable wall of federal authority, were 4 stone-faced agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Reynolds stood at the center. His expression was rigid, his jaw locked tight with grim determination to execute the federal warrants tucked inside his breast pocket. He gave me a single sharp nod of confirmation. The trap was fully primed. It was time to pull the lever. I reached out and firmly pushed the mahogany doors wide open. The thick wood swung outward with a loud thud that echoed sharply. I stepped directly into the brilliant light of the grand ballroom, flanked by Mike and the wall of federal agents. The overwhelming presence of our arrival created an immediate physical ripple through the dense crowd. The elegant melody of the jazz orchestra screeched to a sudden jarring halt as the conductor noticed the federal windbreakers stepping into the room. A heavy, suffocating silence instantly descended upon the massive ballroom. The lively hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations died out in a matter of seconds. The sea of wealthy elites, politicians, and military generals physically parted in front of me, stepping back to create a wide, clear path leading straight toward the main stage. The primal human instinct to step away from incoming destruction commanded their movements. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead, staring directly at the head table. Diane turned her head toward the entrance, annoyed by the sudden interruption. The moment her eyes locked onto my face, the haughty, arrogant smile completely vanished from her lips. The color instantly drained from her manicured face, leaving her skin a ghastly, chalky white. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp of pure terror. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the delicate crystal champagne flute slipped right through her fingers. The expensive glass hit the polished marble floor and shattered into 100 glittering pieces, the sharp breaking sound echoing loudly across the silent room. She stared at me, completely paralyzed by the impossible sight of the man she thought she had permanently discarded. Up on the raised stage, Martin physically stumbled backward. The confident posture of a triumphant billionaire evaporated in a fraction of a second. He aggressively gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning stark white as he desperately tried to keep his balance. His face turned a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened and closed several times, but he could not force a single word through his vocal cords. He stared at the 4 federal agents standing directly behind me, his eyes widening in absolute horrific realization. He knew instantly that his meticulously constructed empire was collapsing right in front of him. However, Jason did not grasp the severe, catastrophic reality of the situation. He was too deeply blinded by his own profound arrogance and massive sense of entitlement to understand the lethal danger walking toward him. He saw me stepping into the ballroom, and his face immediately contorted into a mask of furious, undisguised rage. He slammed his glass of bourbon down onto a nearby cocktail table, ignoring the military generals he had been trying to impress just moments ago. He aggressively stepped forward, blocking the center aisle, firmly believing he still held all the power. His voice boomed across the silent ballroom, dripping with contempt and furious indignation. He demanded to know what I thought I was doing, crashing his private corporate event. He shouted my name with absolute disrespect, dropping the facade of a loving son. He wildly waved his hand in the air and loudly ordered the hotel security team to immediately remove the trespassing felon from the premises. 4 muscular private security guards, dressed in black suits, quickly stepped out from the perimeter of the ballroom. They moved aggressively toward the center aisle, fully intending to grab my shoulders and physically drag me out the heavy doors. They took exactly 3 steps before Special Agent Reynolds smoothly stepped in front of me. Reynolds did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and flipped open his leather wallet, revealing the shining gold badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked directly at the lead security guard and softly advised them to stand down immediately unless they wished to be arrested for interfering with an active federal operation. The 4 private guards froze instantly, raising their hands in compliance, and quickly backed away into the shadows. Jason stood completely frozen in the center of the aisle, his arrogant bravado instantly shattering as the horrifying reality of the federal badges registered in his mind. He slowly took a step backward, his mouth falling open in silent shock. I did not look at him. I did not waste a single word on the boy who had gladly lived off my stolen wealth. I walked straight past him, leaving Jason trembling in the crowd. I approached the velvet-lined stairs leading to the main platform. Every single eye in the grand ballroom was fixed on me. I calmly climbed the steps, the fabric of my custom tuxedo moving with quiet, lethal elegance. I stepped up to the wooden podium. Martin was visibly hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. I looked into his terrified eyes with absolute freezing calm. I reached out my hand, perfectly steady, and firmly took the microphone directly from his violently trembling fingers. I adjusted the heavy microphone stand, bringing it closer to my mouth. The screech of audio feedback pierced the dead silence of the ballroom, causing several prominent politicians to visibly wince. I looked out over the sea of bewildered faces. Hundreds of the most powerful individuals in Chicago stared up at me, their champagne glasses frozen in midair. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, commanding the attention of every person in the room. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of the last 9 years lifting off my shoulders. I spoke with a calm, resonant authority. I said good evening to the distinguished guests. I formally introduced myself as Thomas Barrett, the true founder of the logistics empire they were celebrating tonight. Shocked whispers rippled through the crowd. I turned my head slowly, locking my eyes onto Martin Cole. He was standing a few feet away, sweating profusely, looking like a trapped animal. I told the audience that Martin recently asked me to sign a restrictive contract. I reached inside the interior pocket of my custom-tailored tuxedo jacket. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder and held it up for the entire ballroom to see. I told them I brought the paperwork with me tonight, just as he requested. I stepped away from the podium and walked directly over to Martin. His chest heaved with panicked breaths. He instinctively raised his hands, desperately trying to back away, but the edge of the stage blocked his retreat. I aggressively shoved the manila folder against his chest, forcing his trembling hands to grasp it. I leaned in close, keeping my voice loud enough for the microphone to pick up every word. I told him the document inside was not a non-disclosure agreement. I told him it was an authorized federal warrant from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I announced clearly that he was being charged with corporate espionage, systemic wire fraud, and defrauding the United States Department of Defense. The grand ballroom erupted. The collective gasp of 500 wealthy elites sounded like a sudden violent intake of oxygen. Panic flooded the room. Several military generals immediately stood up, their faces flushed with righteous fury, as they realized they had just awarded a massive defense contract to a criminal syndicate. Special Agent Reynolds did not waste another second. He stepped onto the stage with swift tactical precision, followed closely by 2 armed federal agents. Reynolds grabbed Martin by the shoulders, forcefully spinning him around. The sharp metallic clatter of heavy steel handcuffs locking around Martin's wrists echoed loudly over the chaotic murmur of the crowd. Martin's knees completely buckled, his entire empire instantly vaporizing as the agents physically restrained him. Down on the main floor, the facade of untouchable elegance shattered. Diane let out a shrill, piercing scream that cut through the noise of the panicked crowd. She abandoned her carefully cultivated poise and aggressively pushed her way through the bewildered politicians. She charged up the carpeted steps of the stage, her velvet gown trailing wildly behind her. She lunged directly at me, her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. She raised her hands and violently slapped my chest, her diamond rings catching the stage lights as she struck me. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with absolute hysteria. She called me a vindictive bastard. She screamed that I was completely ruining our beautiful family, destroying everything they had built. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, letting her strike my chest a second time before a federal agent stepped forward and firmly restrained her arms behind her back. She struggled wildly against the agent's grip, her flawless makeup ruined by streaks of dark mascara and furious tears. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, icy disgust. The woman I had loved, the woman I had built a fortune to protect, looked like a desperate, pathetic stranger. I shook my head slowly, staring into her wide, panicked eyes. I told her that she did not have a family. I told her she only had a parasitic arrangement funded by my stolen labor. I turned my attention away from my frantic wife and looked toward the edge of the stage. Michael Gallagher was standing quietly near the main audiovisual control panel. He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. I gave him a single sharp nod of confirmation. Mike firmly pressed the primary input button on his remote override device. The massive projector screens mounted behind the stage instantly flickered to life. The glowing corporate logos disappeared completely. They were immediately replaced by the undeniable digital evidence we had extracted from the hidden servers. The screen flashed the encrypted emails Diane had sent to Martin 11 years ago. The text was magnified perfectly, allowing every politician, investor, and military general in the room to read her exact malicious words. They read her explicit instructions, detailing how to route the stolen cartel money through my personal banking portals. They read her ruthless demand, begging them to ensure I received a minimum of 10 years in a maximum security prison so she could comfortably liquidate my private assets. The collective silence in the room deepened into a horrifying, suffocating void. The elite society of Chicago stood frozen, completely paralyzed by the unadulterated evil displayed on the massive screens. Diane stopped struggling against the federal agent. She stared up at her own vicious words, her mouth hanging open in silent, absolute horror. She knew there was no possible defense left. She knew no plausible lie could explain away the concrete digital proof of her betrayal. But I was not finished. The true devastation had not yet been delivered. I gave Mike one final signal. The projector screen shifted again, dissolving the treacherous emails and replacing them with a scanned, highly magnified copy of the clinical laboratory document. The official medical stationery glowed brightly against the dark backdrop of the stage. I looked down into the crowd and locked eyes with Jason. He was standing completely motionless at the front of the center aisle. The arrogant, condescending smirk he had worn at the diner was entirely gone. His face was twisted in profound, agonizing confusion as he read the demographic information printed on the screen. He read his own name. Then he read the name of his biological father. The probability of paternity was displayed in massive, bold numbers. 99.9%. The crushing reality slammed into his mind with the force of a physical blow. He physically staggered backward, bumping a small cocktail table, his eyes darting between me, his mother, and the handcuffed billionaire he called his uncle. I walked slowly to the edge of the wooden stage, looking directly down at the trembling young man who had gladly spent my stolen money. I kept my voice perfectly even, broadcasting my final judgment loudly and clearly through the microphone. I looked at Jason, then shifted my gaze to my frantic wife. I told Diane I did not ruin this family tonight. I told her she ruined it 28 years ago when she built a life upon completely grotesque lies. I pointed directly at the handcuffed man behind me. I looked back down at the stunned boy in the crowd. I told Jason to meet his real father. I told them they absolutely deserved each other. The grand ballroom instantly transformed into a frantic stampede. Politicians realized they were standing in a federal crime scene and sprinted toward the exits. A state senator shoved through bewildered guests, barking orders into his phone to distance his campaign from our logistics firm. Military generals quickly grouped together, furious, as they ordered aides to contact the Pentagon. They knew federal auditors would arrive by morning. The elegant charity gala evaporated into a pathetic display of self-preservation. Jason remained frozen on the main floor. His crystal glass was forgotten. He stared at the projector screen, tracing the paternity results, hoping the words would magically rearrange themselves. The devastating truth was finally penetrating his thick, arrogant skull. He slowly turned, pulling his shocked gaze away from the document to look directly at Martin. The very man he had called his uncle, the man who had funded his lavish lifestyle and secured his prestigious corporate position, was actually his true biological father. The revelation did exactly the opposite of bringing them closer. Jason's eyes darted toward the armed federal agents firmly holding Martin's shoulders. The profound realization finally washed over him. His entire life was a carefully constructed lie, but more importantly, his multi-million-dollar trust fund was built entirely on dirty, stolen money. He knew the government would seize every single penny. He was no longer the wealthy heir to a logistics empire. How was the illegitimate son of a convicted federal traitor? He stumbled backward, unable to process the total destruction of his privileged existence. Up on the elevated stage, the dark reality settled over Martin with crushing weight. The heavy steel handcuffs dug sharply into his wrists, pinning his arms awkwardly behind his back. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire persona had completely vanished, replaced by the desperate, frantic pleading of a cornered animal. He leaned his head forward, trying to close the physical distance between us, desperate to keep his voice from carrying over the chaotic noise of the fleeing crowd. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely stripped of their former pride. He begged me to listen to him. He whispered my name, his voice cracking with dry, raspy panic. He said we could still make a deal. He promised to sign over all of his voting shares immediately. He told me I could keep the entire company, the government contracts, and the corporate headquarters. He begged me to just call off the federal agents and let Diane walk away without any criminal charges. I was trying to salvage a single piece of his shattered life, desperately attempting to negotiate from a position of absolute powerlessness. I did not step back from him. I leaned in incredibly close, ensuring that my voice would only reach his ears. I wanted this moment to be profoundly intimate. I stared directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes, keeping my expression perfectly calm and entirely devoid of mercy. I told him he fundamentally misunderstood the situation. I explained that we were not negotiating a corporate settlement. I reminded him of the original limited liability company charter we had mutually drafted and signed over 30 years ago. I slowly recited the exact phrasing of the poison pill contingency clause I had personally woven into the foundational bylaws. I watched the dawning horror spread across his ashen face as I explained the lethal mechanism he had just triggered. I told him that because he was now officially charged with corporate fraud, and because I possessed the irrefutable digital evidence proving he had orchestrated my wrongful conviction, he immediately and permanently forfeited his entire ownership stake. But I did not stop there. I kept my voice low, delivering the final devastating blow. I explained that the poison pill did not just apply to his corporate shares. It explicitly mandated the immediate surrender of all personal assets tied to the wealth generated by the firm. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I now legally owned 100% of the company. I told him I owned the massive estate in Highland Park. I owned the imported luxury cars sitting in his driveway. I owned every single dollar he had desperately tried to hide in his offshore accounts. I told him he had absolutely nothing left to bargain with. He was completely ruined. I stepped back, looking down at his trembling, defeated posture. I told him he was going to spend the rest of his natural life rotting in a federal cell, and Diane was going to be thrown out onto the cold streets. Hearing her name, Diane let out a sharp, agonizing sob. She had stopped fighting against the federal agent restraining her. The absolute finality of my words had broken her completely. The malicious, calculating woman who had orchestrated my imprisonment was gone. She suddenly dropped heavily to her knees, her expensive velvet gown pooling around her on the hard wooden stage. She looked up at me, sobbing real desperate tears this time. The theatrical crying she had performed in the kitchen was replaced by genuine, unfiltered terror. She begged me to show her mercy. She cried out my name, her voice shaking violently. She pleaded with me, swearing that she had absolutely nothing left. She reminded me that she had not worked a single day in 30 years. She sobbed that she did not even have a basic resume, no savings of her own, and no place to go. She raised her trembling hands, begging me to let her keep just a fraction of the marital assets, so she would not be entirely destitute. I looked down at the woman who had shared my bed for decades. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering affection. I only felt the cold, hard satisfaction of total justice. I did not bend down to help her up. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply stepped around her kneeling form, treating her like an obstacle in my path. I looked down at her tear-streaked face and delivered my final response. I told her she should try calling Jason. I suggested that if she asked nicely, perhaps her son would let her sleep on his living room couch. I turned my back on her as she collapsed onto the stage, burying her face in her hands, letting out a loud, pathetic wail of absolute despair. Special Agent Reynolds gave me a firm, respectful nod. He grabbed Martin by the upper arm and forcefully turned him toward the rear exit of the stage. I watched as the federal agents dragged my former best friend away in handcuffs. The powerful billionaire stumbled awkwardly down the velvet stairs, humiliated in front of the very people he had tried to impress. The room was still buzzing with chaotic whispers, but the path to the main entrance remained perfectly clear. I adjusted the lapels of my custom tuxedo and began walking down the center aisle. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, confident stride of a man who had just reclaimed his entire world. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors and stepped out of the grand ballroom, leaving the shattered remains of their parasitic lives far behind me. I walked out the front doors of the hotel and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The cool evening breeze washed over my face. For the first time in nearly a decade, the air in Chicago smelled incredibly sweet. 3 months passed. The federal justice system moves slowly for most people, but when defrauding the United States Department of Defense is involved, the hammer falls with terrifying, merciless speed. Martin Cole faced a highly publicized trial that captivated the entire city. With the unassailable digital evidence extracted from his own air-gapped servers, his high-priced defense attorneys had absolutely nothing to work with. He was swiftly convicted on multiple counts of corporate espionage, systemic wire fraud, and treasonous deception against the military. The federal judge showed zero leniency during the sentencing hearing, condemning him to 20 consecutive years in a maximum security penitentiary. Diane fared no better in the courtroom. She was slapped with severe accessory charges for her active role in orchestrating my wrongful conviction. Because she was officially implicated in the initial fraud, the poison pill clause stripped her of every single marital asset. She walked out of this courthouse with nothing but the clothes on her back, completely destitute, and universally despised by the high society friends she had spent decades trying to impress. Her tearful pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, as the irrefutable proof of her malicious betrayal was permanently recorded in the public judicial archives for everyone to read. Jason refused to accept his new reality. Driven by the same arrogant entitlement that had blinded him his entire life, he attempted to launch a massive civil lawsuit against me to reclaim his offshore trust fund. He hired a flashy attorney, loudly claiming the money was a legal inheritance from Martin. But Michael Gallagher dismantled his pathetic case in a single afternoon. Mike cleanly demonstrated to the presiding judge that the trust had been funded entirely by stolen corporate assets. The federal government immediately seized the entire account, liquidating the millions to pay mandatory restitution fines. Jason was left entirely bankrupt. Without his massive trust fund, his luxury sports car, or his prestigious executive title, his entire fabricated identity collapsed overnight. The last I heard from my private investigators, he was working as a mid-level shift manager at a big box retail store out in the distant suburbs. He is currently struggling to cover the rent for a tiny, run-down apartment, desperately trying to pay off Diane's mounting legal fees while she awaits her own trial. The boy who had once sneered at me in a diner ordering me to stay in a cheap motel was now experiencing the exact financial humiliation he had casually wished upon me. With the parasites finally removed from my life, I returned to the massive estate in Highland Park. Walking through those heavy double mahogany doors as a free, vindicated man was an indescribable feeling. But the grand house still carried the foul, suffocating stench of their 30-year betrayal. Every single room was a meticulously decorated museum dedicated to their endless deception. So I hired a massive professional demolition crew. I ordered them to completely gut the entire interior of the mansion. We ripped out the imported marble countertops, tore down the expensive modern art, and shattered the crystal chandeliers that Diane had so proudly displayed for her wealthy friends. I took every single piece of custom furniture Martin and Diane had purchased, with my money, dragged it out to the expansive backyard patio, and built a massive, towering bonfire. I stood in the freezing winter air, watching the velvet sofas and silk curtains burn to absolute ash. I watched the bright orange flames dance against the dark evening sky, physically and symbolically, purging the sprawling estate of their toxic, parasitic memory. I stood by the fire until nothing remained but glowing embers, feeling a profound, deeply satisfying sense of closure wash over my tired soul. Restoring my personal sanctuary was only the beginning of my resurrection. The corporate empire required immediate, decisive stabilization. The overwhelming scandal of Martin's dramatic public arrest had caused a brief, violent plunge in the company stock. Investors were panicked, and the board of directors was completely terrified of impending federal audits. But I stepped back into the executive boardroom with a steady hand and an unbreakable iron will. I officially renamed the corporation Barrett Logistics, permanently erasing the coal legacy from the global industry forever. I appointed Michael Gallagher as my new chief legal officer. He was handsomely compensated for his unparalleled loyalty and brilliant legal mind. He took immense visible pleasure in swiftly firing every single corrupt executive Martin had hired over the past decade. Within 2 months, I successfully renegotiated the highly lucrative Department of Defense contracts. I assured the nervous generals that the proprietary routing algorithm was safely back in the capable hands of its true patriotic creator. The volatile market responded incredibly well to my confident leadership, and the company stock steadily climbed back to its record high. The business community quickly realized that the original visionary had returned, bringing a renewed era of transparency and ruthless efficiency to the enterprise. Now, 3 months after that fateful night at the charity gala, I found myself standing in the sprawling executive suite on the 40th floor. The massive Italian oak desk I had hidden beneath during my covert infiltration was now polished and sitting proudly in the exact center of the room. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, looking out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The towering skyscrapers pierced the low-hanging winter clouds, glowing brightly against the darkening evening sky. The monumental, crushing weight of the last decade had finally vanished from my weary shoulders. I had walked out of a federal prison with absolutely nothing but a cheap gray suit and a burning, relentless desire for justice. I had faced a billionaire thief, a treacherous wife, and a deceitful son, and dismantled their stolen universe. I was no longer a victim of a broken system. I was the undisputed architect of my own absolute redemption. The corporate empire was finally mine again, stronger than ever. I reached out and gently traced the smooth wooden edge of my executive desk, feeling the solid reality of my triumphant return. The painful wounds of the past were fully healed, replaced by a formidable armor built from undeniable resilience and unwavering determination. The storm had passed, leaving behind a clear, unclouded vision for the prosperous future that lay ahead of me. Every single obstacle they had placed in my path had ultimately transformed into a stepping stone toward my ultimate victory. I had reclaimed my name, my fortune, and my rightful place at the absolute pinnacle of the logistics industry. I took a deep, refreshing breath, savoring the incredibly sweet taste of pure, unadulterated freedom. They had tried to bury me in the dark, but they had foolishly forgotten that I was the one who controlled the light. My legacy was no longer a tragic tale of betrayal and loss. It was a powerful, enduring testament to the sheer strength of the human spirit. I stood tall in the quiet office, ready to face whatever new challenges the world dared to throw at me. I opened the top drawer of the desk and pulled out a small framed photograph. It was a picture of me taken on the very first day I launched this company, standing next to a single rusted delivery truck. I placed the heavy frame back onto the wooden desk. The grueling, agonizing war was completely over. I had emerged as the absolute victor. I was finally truly home. I take a sip of scotch. At 70 years old, society tells you your life is over. They told me 9 years in a cell would break me. But iron is forged in the fire. The amber liquid burns pleasantly as it travels down my throat, serving as a fiery reminder that I am still standing. They expected me to wither away behind those brutal concrete walls. They wanted me consumed by complete bitterness and the cold reality of a life sentence I did not deserve. But they were entirely wrong. Iron is not destroyed in the flames. It transforms. I look at a clean, empty desk. No pictures of a fake family. No illusions. It is a lonely victory, but a pure one. I am no longer blinded by the people I thought loved me. My past life was merely a beautiful lie. It was a carefully constructed facade built upon trust that was entirely misplaced. This fresh reality is stripped of all those toxic shadows. I gaze out across the vast office space. The walls are lined with tall windows that overlook the glittering skyline of a massive city I once ruled, briefly lost, and have conquered again. When the federal authorities first came for me nearly a decade ago, I was completely blindsided. I had built my company from a single rented room into a titan of industry. I had given my son everything. I provided a world-class education, a prime seat at the executive table, and the literal keys to the kingdom. I did not know he was actively using those keys to unlock hidden doors to the criminal underworld. I did not know he was laundering millions through offshore accounts, burying his tracks so deep that the paper trail led directly to my desk. My own son stood in the courtroom wearing the expensive custom suit I bought him and testified against me. He played the tragic, disillusioned son perfectly. He wept convincingly on the stand. He told the jury how he had tried to stop me, how my personal greed had compromised our family name. I watched him lie under oath, realizing in that chilling moment that the boy I raised had died long ago. He was replaced by a ruthless, calculating stranger. I survived the ultimate betrayal not by breaking down, but by weaponizing my patience inside that dark, lonely prison cell. I outsmarted the people who thought they had buried me. The prison yard is a dangerous place for an old man, but it offers absolute mental clarity. There are no corporate distractions. There is only time. I used every single second of that precious time. While my son took over my company, rebranded it, and celebrated his brilliant succession, I sat quietly in the prison library. I read every legal precedent, every financial statute, and every loophole he thought he had successfully exploited. I discreetly reached out to former colleagues who had not been bought by my son's corrupt regime. We communicated in carefully coded letters, slow and deliberate. My son thought he had completely eliminated me, but he merely planted a seed deep underground. He got comfortable. He got arrogant. He truly believed that an old man wearing an orange jumpsuit was no longer a viable threat. That arrogance caused him to start making terrible mistakes. Without my strict oversight, his greed multiplied rapidly. He blindly expanded his illicit laundering operations, bringing in significantly more dangerous clients, getting much sloppier with his corporate ledgers. From my solitary cell, I effectively orchestrated a massive silent audit of his entire empire. Through my highly trusted outside contacts, we painstakingly gathered the digital breadcrumbs my son carelessly left behind. We compiled fake bank statements, encrypted emails, and numerous offshore wire transfers. We slowly built an impenetrable fortress of hard evidence. Then, when the timing was absolutely perfect, when he was finalizing the biggest corporate merger of his career, we finally struck. We delivered the entire comprehensive dossier directly to the Justice Department. It was a flawless, devastating execution. I did not just expose his massive criminal enterprise. I completely exonerated myself in the very same swift, calculated, and totally undeniable legal stroke. The identical federal agents who had wrongfully arrested me violently stormed his luxury penthouse. I was fully released less than 1 month later. My previous conviction completely overturned my personal assets, unfrozen, and returned with significant interest. My betraying son is now serving a 20-year sentence in the exact same maximum security facility that he maliciously sent me to. He desperately begged for a private meeting right before his final prison transfer. He actually wanted to explain, to apologize, to selfishly invoke the sacred bond of father and son. I coldly declined the pathetic request without any hesitation whatsoever. The arrogant man who wore my honorable name had permanently forfeited the absolute right to my valuable time. I pour myself another small measure of premium scotch, letting the heavy silence of the massive room wash over me. The cowardly executives who previously turned their backs. The corrupt politicians who suddenly stopped taking my urgent calls. They have all shamelessly tried to crawl back. They constantly send lavish gift baskets and desperately extend exclusive invitations to fancy galas, pathetically pretending the last ruined decade was just a terrible misunderstanding. I happily accept their expensive gifts, but flatly decline their invitations. I simply do not need their fragile validation. I do not need their fake smiles or their incredibly hollow apologies. I have finally learned to rely entirely on my own sharp judgment and my own proven instincts. The company is mine again, completely purged of my son's extremely toxic influence. I have purposely surrounded myself with smart people who genuinely value strict loyalty over quick, illicit profits. These new partners truly understand that unshakable integrity is the only corporate currency that actually lasts. I am actively rebuilding the vast empire, but certainly not to leave it to an ungrateful heir. Instead, I want to establish a permanent foundation that will proudly outlast me. A charitable foundation dedicated exclusively to providing robust legal defense for innocent individuals who have been wrongfully accused by malicious actors. We will fight for decent people who do not have the financial resources to successfully battle a broken, corrupt justice system. That will be my ultimate true legacy. I walk over to the large window and gently place my bare hand against the freezing cold glass. The busy city directly below is a beautiful sea of bright moving lights representing millions of innocent, hardworking people living. They are completely unaware of the quiet, ruthless battles fought daily in the hidden corporate shadows. I thoughtfully consider the intense, boiling anger that powerfully sustained me during those terrifying first few years inside that miserable prison. It was a fiercely burning, totally destructive negative force. But over time, I successfully learned to effectively distill that wild anger into pure, unbreakable focus. True justice is simply the undeniable objective truth finally brought into the glaring light. It is aggressively reclaiming exactly what is rightfully yours, and happily watching the wicked guilty utterly consume themselves with their own monumental blinding hubris. At 70, my guarded heart is finally at peace. I survived the unimaginable betrayal of a child. I look at my reflection. The deep lines show hardship, but my bright eyes refuse victimhood. I am Thomas Barrett. I lost a decade, but I gained my freedom, dignity, and my empire. Life will sometimes hand you the ultimate betrayal from the exact people you trusted with your life. When that happens, your first instinct is to scream, to break down, to demand why. Do not do that. Emotion is the enemy of justice. Silence is your greatest weapon. Let your betrayers believe they have won. Let them get comfortable in their arrogance. While they are celebrating, you must be working in the shadows, gathering your strength and building your case. Vengeance is not a loud explosion. Rather, it is a quiet, calculated chess move that leaves your enemies with absolutely nothing. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible tales of survival and ultimate justice. Have you ever experienced a shocking betrayal from someone you deeply trusted? How did you gather the strength to fight back? Drop your story in the comments below.